Good afternoon and welcome, welcome, welcome. We are back building power, grassroots education advocacy. With me, I am your host, Zakiya Sankara Jabbar. Excited to be back with everybody today. A little bit of housekeeping. If you're watching us right now, please hit the thumbs up button, hit the like button. If you have not subscribed to our channel, also be sure you subscribe today and share this broadcast. Today, I am hosting Professor Mark Warren, PhD. He is teaching at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and he and I are going to be in conversation today about the work to end the school-to-prison pipeline in the United States as we know it. Welcome, Mark. Feel free to introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay. Well, thank you, Zakiya. Thank you for inviting me here today. As Zakiya says, I'm a professor. I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and I consider myself a community engaged scholar or an activist scholar. So I've been studying and working with community organizing groups that work with parents and students across the United States, trying to campaign and organize for racial justice and educational justice in our schools and communities. And Zakiya and I have worked together for a number of years before as well. So I'm happy to be partnering with her again today to talk about a book that had just been published, literally just off the press, called Willful Defiance, on the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And I'll show you a copy because it is literally, I just got it myself, and very excited to be here to be the first time talking about it now that the book is actually published.
Yes, and it's been a little while coming. I'm excited to have an essay in the beginning of the book. Again, this is our second time partnering on a book. You and I have also worked together for your previous book. And then we're also still working together through the People's Think Tank. So I'm excited to have you here to talk about this work. We also included a link to where people can actually purchase the book. There is a 30% off code. So hopefully people will grab that book and people can actually use it in their own work if they're working in education justice and ensuring equity for Black and Brown and other students of color. Yeah. So, Mark, I feel like, it's been a while since you've been here, and I feel like our audience may need a little bit of a refresher. Talk a little bit about sort of your history of just in social movements in general, and how you really became to be a partner, because certainly you're an academic. You probably also consider yourself an organizer, but it's not every day that you find academics such as yourself, someone who's taught at Harvard and is now teaching at UMass Boston. You usually don't see those kind of partnerships in a real authentic way. So I would love to just hear a little bit about sort of how you got there.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. So I think that the work and the way that I approach being a researcher and a scholar is different from mainstream academia, although I think that there are a lot of scholars like me, particularly a whole new generation, maybe a little younger than me, a lot of scholars of color, a lot of women of color, who really feel that, research needs to support communities who are struggling for social change, for social justice, for racial equity. That really should be our role, and that too often scholars and academics are, doing research from above, and real people are just kind of fodder for their theories and their, I am a white male sociologist, and we have a long history of white male sociologists who came and studied Black communities and perpetuated stereotypes and did real harm and still do, for that matter, frankly. And so if we're going to be different, if I'm going to be different, then I need to think about how do I go out and really form deep partnerships with in communities of color, with African American, Latinx, indigenous people who are really struggling for change in their communities. And I need to listen to them and work together so that we can produce a work like Willful Defiance, which I think tries to document and lift up the work that people are doing and share that out. People need to know that there is wisdom, there is knowledge, there is organizing talent. There are really committed people who are working for change and really making change in their communities. And these stories are not typically told. It's all negative. It's all dysfunction. It's all a problem. And, that's not my approach. Yes, there are issues, there are problems, but there are real strengths and resources and assets and skills and knowledge. And I would like to go out and work with people and use my talents and my abilities in ways that support those kinds of struggles rather than being, holding them from afar. And I think that was my approach. I've shared this story before with you, Zakiya. I grew up in a white working class blue collar family and neighborhood, all white segregated. But my father was an unusual he's a white blue collar guy, union activist, but he was also an anti-racist, which was, I think, unusual for that time, maybe still is. And he really raised me with the values that working people had to organize and fight to get anywhere in this world, and that working people had to find a way to come together and support each other across racial lines if we were ever going to achieve any real gains. And so I actually became an organizer before I became an academic. I worked as a community organizer and a labor organizer for many years. So when I went into academia, I went in thinking, wow, there are just, amazing people in communities. There are amazing organizers who really have, they're theorists too. Theorists are not, monopolized in the academy. There are people on the ground who are doing theorizing from their lived experience and their observations of experience. And rather than, be separated from them or just use their knowledge for my own purposes, I should try to find a way to partner with them. And so I've been on that journey, and I've learned a lot from people in community, and I've learned a lot from other activists. I've learned a lot from my family. All these influences, I think, have tried to keep me going on this journey that I hope is contributing to change that we really need, and that we all, I want. I'm a white man, but I want to live in a society that is racially just, where everybody has the ability to develop their full humanity. That's the kind of society I wanted to raise my children into. I don't want to fall back on my white privileges. I want to use those privileges to be a resource for people who are trying to change things.
And that's I'm glad you gave that background, because I think that really sets us up to really hop into the conversation about this particular book, and just why you decided to do sort of a part 2 chronicling the movement primarily led by Black and Brown and Indigenous folks across the country to end the school to prison pipeline. And what interested you most about this particular movement?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story too, I think. So I had been working with and writing about community organizing efforts at education reform. And I had been really writing about them as local phenomena, like a box around, or what happened in Los Angeles or what happened in Denver. And I was at Harvard at the time, and you mentioned I did teach at Harvard for 10 years, and I worked on a book there with Karen Knapp, who some people may know for her work with the family community engagement, and about 17 doctoral students, a huge project. And we wrote a book called The Match on Dry Grass. And we had 6 organizing examples in there, all treated locally. And I think in some ways at the time when we started that project, 2006, that was somewhat true. It was basically accurate. But by the time the book came out 6 years later, it takes 6 years usually to do these books, the situation had changed. All of a sudden, a lot of the what have been local organizing groups were finding a way to band together and needed to band together in order to create a larger movement. And I think the school to prison pipeline movement was at the forefront of that. And it was led by organizers of color, parents and students of color. And that was also a shift. It was an explicitly anti-racist movement. Some of the organizing efforts early on, I go back and I talk to our friend Maisie Chin, who you know, and she talks about starting to do this organizing around the year 2000, and you couldn't get any support for it. The foundation.
It's 21 years for them.
Don't talk about racism. Don't talk about racism. Don't talk about the school to prison pipeline. That's not going to get you anywhere. So that was a breakthrough. That was countercultural and a breakthrough. And so I was a little behind the times, in that sense, but ready to learn and listen. And so what I was hearing, in fact, we had a conference for the book, and Maisie Chin was one of the founders of the Dignity School campaign, actually came to that conference and talked about this Dignity in Schools campaign, a national coalition of local organizing groups who banded together, not just to lobby in Washington, but to pool their resources to share and learn from each other so they could strengthen their local organizing work. And that really interested me. And I really wanted to learn more about that, and thought that is the kind of work also now that needs to be documented and lifting up and brought to light and shared. I will also say I had a personal connection as well to this. So I'm married to a Black British woman who's a teacher in Boston Public Schools, and we have two beautiful Black biracial daughters. And when we were in schools, they were in schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts when I was at Harvard. And when my older daughter entered middle school, it was racially diverse, and the teacher started to target the Black students. And started suspending them and expelling them, and zero tolerance discipline was being implemented on the Black students and not on the white students. And they were getting alienated. My daughter was getting alienated. And this was a child who had loved school, who had loved learning. And all of a sudden, she doesn't want to go to school. She doesn't want to learn. So we were seeing the school to prison pipeline starting to play out right in front of our eyes. And even though I am a white man, in my extended family and their friendship network, we were experiencing it. And, my wife and I started complaining about the racism at the school, and we were targeted by the administration. We were investigated. And, and so we have some other resources maybe that a lot of other people don't have. I appreciate that. We're not in the same situation as a lot of other people, but we did experience it. And so firsthand, I was saying, wow, this is not just something that's happening out there in places that I'm traveling to. It's something happening in my own family. And so I felt even more motivated that we can't really talk about educational justice in this country unless we're talking about the school to prison pipeline. And I need to go out and partner with the Dignity in Schools campaign, with the Alliance for Educational Justice, which is a national alliance of youth organizing groups working on the school to prison pipeline, and then partnering with the local organizing groups who are down in the streets, on the grounds, in the schools and communities. And one of them was Racial Justice Now in Dayton, Ohio. And that's how I first met Zakiya, when I went to Dayton to learn about the work that they were doing there. And I also traveled to Los Angeles and Chicago, and actually started in the Mississippi Delta, the heart of the plantation South and white supremacy in this country. And that is really where this movement began. It didn't begin because scholars started talking about it. It didn't begin because of the mainstream civil rights community was talking about the school to prison pipeline. It began when African-American parents in places like Holmes County in the heart of the Mississippi Delta started saying, hey, why are our kids out on the street all day? Why are they being railroaded into these juvenile justice facilities? And they started to name what they called at that time the schoolhouse to jailhouse track, which then became the school to prison pipeline, but the same basic idea. And people need to know that it's Black and brown parents and students who are themselves the direct victims of this injustice, who are really the first to name it and start to build a movement to dismantle it.
That's right. It was Black mamas and daddies and grandmas and grandpas in the Mississippi Delta that started this movement, y'all. If you're just joining us, I am interviewing Mark Warren. He is a professor of public policy at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and he is also a friend of my family's. And we're talking about ending the school to prison pipeline in the United States in his new book, Willful Defiance. And we also have some links in the comments for folks to go and check that out and purchase the book. You'll even get a 30% off discount. Mark, you talked about coming to Dayton. You know, I have to tell the story. So Racial Justice Now is a community organization co-founded by me, for folks who are listening, if you may not know that, currently run by my partner and my husband and Carolyn, who is the DMV chapter director. And before we launched the DMV chapter, Racial Justice Now was started 10 years ago this month in Dayton, Ohio. And I found out about Mark's new book project through my work with the Dignity in Schools campaign. At the time, I was serving as their national co-chair of the work there. And I found out about it and I said, oh, wow. I was like, this is amazing. I'm glad that you're actually going to do a book to catalog this work that's been happening around the country. I said, well, the Midwest got something to say. I was like, we doing this work, you know, in Dayton, Ohio. And I said, you should really come and check out the parents that are organizing in Dayton. I said, and you should really learn about our unique story. And I still think that our work is very unique. Ohio, for a very long time, was a bellwether state. That means it could go either way for people who don't know that political lingo, a purple state, all that stuff. And at the time, the legislature was controlled by all Republicans. And so this kind of work, especially being led by poor and working class Black folks, was not thought to be successful at the state level. But we actually ended up being very successful at the state level, which is a very, very unique story. And I do think our story is unique, even in your book, Willful Defiance, because these kind of things don't usually happen, especially for poor and working class Black folks under that kind of political regime. So Mark ears kind of perked up. It was like, maybe I need to come and see what y'all are about. So he did. And as they say, the rest is history. Actually, the chapter or the essay that I have in this book actually features some of those parents that you interviewed. I believe it's right?
Yeah.
What did you think? Tell us, what did you think when you came to Dayton? Was that your first time being in Dayton?
Yeah, it was actually my first time coming to Dayton, which I think is important because there are all of these Daytons around the country.
That's exactly right.
They're not New York City. They're not Los Angeles, right? They're not number one in the media spotlight. And yet this is the reality of this, where the school to prison pipeline has its roots. I mean, not that it's not, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. That's right.
But it's not
everywhere Black people
places that get the attention.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, neither is the movement, right? And so I think it's important to say, okay, well, what are people doing in places that don't have a lot of media and don't have a lot of infrastructure for organizing? Like part of what impressed me about Racial Justice Now in Dayton was the ability of, you know, you and other Black parents, mainly, to organize and win incredible victories in places that weren't used to a lot of organizing, that didn't have a lot of private foundations who had money for you. And I think that I came to really understand there that, you know, the movement really, when people are doing really deep organizing with parents and students too in various places, but really deep organizing with people who are directly impacted,
Mm-hmm.
But combine that with the support that they're getting from a national movement, resources that they can get from a national movement, the connections, the lessons, the toolkits. That creates a very powerful combination. And it's tough for local groups to really win just on their own in this environment, because the school to prison pipeline has huge forces behind it.
Absolutely.
As do, yeah. So, but on the other hand, we need a national movement that doesn't suck those local folks up and, suck everything out of these local groups and have it be dominated by these professional advocates in Washington. This was a different kind of movement.
Mm-hmm.
Dignity in Schools campaign was a different kind of organization. Yes, there was a focus on federal policy, but even in those cases, money was raised to bring parents and local students and local folks to come to Washington to speak for themselves. It wasn't just the advocates. They might have opened the door, but it was the parents and the young people who came through that door and really directly confronted, whether it was congressional representatives or Department of Education folks. And so anyway, I think in Dayton, I really kind of understood amazing organizing that was happening locally, engaging people, persisting, people telling their stories, the power of that, the persistence of coming over and over again. Then also, very sophisticated networking and relationship building to get, to start to, advocate with the decision makers and the policy makers to get them to see the other side to this. And then to have these resources. So there could be a model student code of conduct with a lot of resources that you all could use from the Dignity in Schools campaign. So that's a big theme of the book. How do you combine local and national organizing? What's the new face of organizing for educational justice today in this country? And it's really deeply rooted local organizing that's connected up across these localities, and that dynamic shifts and changes. But that's the new reality that I learned in places like Dayton.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the other thing that has come up for me, especially recently, Mark, is because, a part of our analysis at Racial Justice Now was that the school to prison pipeline was very expansive, not just in the physical kicking the young people out of school, but the violence was also in the curriculum. And as you know, Hashem, my husband, led our campaign at the organization for a culturally relevant curriculum. Well, as you know, that work is under attack now. That work is under assault now by white parents who are decrying anything that is about, as they say, critical race theory.
Right.
Although critical race theory is only taught in higher education, it is not in K through 12 schools across the country. But I think that what the operatives who are behind couching everything, even social emotional learning, is thought to be a part of this, under this umbrella of critical race theory. And I feel a lot of tension there, specifically from the mainstream media, because the mainstream media never covered the parents that are Black and brown who were fighting at our local school boards to be even heard.
Yeah.
We heard about what was happening to our children being kicked out of the school, which to me is equally as important as listening to a white mom in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is in northern VA, not too far from where I live now, crying about her kindergarten white child coming home because the child felt that she was a bad person because she was white. Why wasn't the media interested in the scores of Black youth over decades who have been funneled directly through the school to prison pipeline through these zero tolerance laws that it took the mamas and daddies in Mississippi to start organizing around, and then the rest of the nation came along? I feel similarly to how I felt when the opioid crisis became a white problem, and certainly now it's a health issue. I feel similar now as how I felt then when crack was criminalized and my parents were were locked up, but now it's a health issue and white people get care, not cops. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, because that's something that's happening literally right now. You know what I mean? Around now you have this, all of this support for the white parents who are showing up at school board meetings decrying critical race theory. And then where were the national cameras when all of the people that you have interviewed for this amazing book, and this is the second book, by the way, on this issue.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, I hear you, and I think that jumping on the term critical race theory, it's really when people are trying to teach anything
right
an anti-racist perspective, like what is the real history of this country in terms of racism, and whether that's anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, what has happened to indigenous people. It's really a struggle around the narrative of this country. Like, is this the land of liberty and freedom, or has it been a land of racial domination? And what's the and getting all students to think critically about that issue.
Right.
And I think that the media is, this really shows, one of the things about the school to prison pipeline is that I think is so important, is that it shows the connections of, white supremacist systems across the institutions of our society. It's so not true. Just in the school, in a box.
Not right.
It's connected to the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system. It's connected to the policing in communities. It's also connected to, lack of affordable housing, economic insecurity, environmental injustice. All these issues are connected, and the media is part of that too, right? So the normal operations of this system keep reinforcing and reproducing racial inequalities, and so the media has to be understood as playing that role as well. And so when grassroots people, when African American parents are starting to talk about this, they have to force the issue into the media,
right?
Because the dominant systems, aren't interested. It all is very interesting to me. I do read the New York Times. And I appreciate it, but I find it it's sort of its opinion of itself as being so great. But you have to read. I don't know if you read any of their apologies that they issued about how they covered lynchings in the South.
Yeah.
And they weren't even in the South. They're supposed to be.
They're terrible. Yeah.
It was Black Brute, the Black Brute. I mean, horrible thing. That they just fed into.
They call Black men, to scare everybody. They dehumanize Black men
in the covering of the lynchings, right?
They deserved it. Well, they do that now with police killings.
Right. You're still right. So we're still having the same thing, right? But I was just saying that, now we're apologizing for what we did 100 years ago or 50 years ago for that, but not looking at, well, what are you doing today? Right.
Exactly.
And so I think that is a struggle that has to be waged. The struggle has to be waged in policy, in our schools, but the struggle has to be waged in the media, and has been waged in the media. How do we change the narrative so that this, speaking not so much of the current thing, but when this movement started, if people are familiar with zero tolerance, so that's the idea.
Right.
Any infraction, there's zero tolerance for any infractions.
Right.
So that's the justification for suspending and expelling students out of school. And, when this movement started, zero tolerance was the law of the land.
Yes.
Every school district had it enshrined in their code. Every state policy, the federal
state policy. There was a law in Ohio that we got repealed.
Yeah, state policy. Every major teachers union are on record as supporting.
They're on record supporting it. Yeah.
Every major education association was on record supporting. So when Black and brown parents and students first started saying, "Hey, this zero tolerance is pushing us out into and criminalizing our young people and pushing us out into prisons, the school prison pipeline," they were told, "You are crazy."
Right.
What are you talking about? The federal government issued an official statement saying there's no such thing as a school to prison pipeline in the United States. That was an official proclamation of the U.S. government, because people had brought it to the UN. that doesn't include the prison pipeline. So that battle had to be waged as well with the media and over the narrative that zero tolerance is not removing quote unquote bad kids so the good kids can learn. It's actually removing hundreds of thousands of average kids who aren't really doing anything different. They're wearing their hat backwards and they're getting suspended for that, right? Or
that's exactly right.
They're challenging the teacher because the history that's being taught is out of a history book that was written in Texas and for Texas students and is replicating a racist narrative about the history. Why are we learning this in our classroom? Well, you're acting up, you're talking back to the teacher, you're being willfully defiant, as we have the title of the book, Willful Defiance.
Right.
Students are being suspended. Hundreds of thousands of students are being suspended for quote unquote willful defiance or quote unquote disrupting school.
Right. Or disruptive behavior. It was the catch-all. It literally was a catch-all to sweep, literally, like you said, over the years, millions of students. But each year across the country, hundreds of thousands of mostly Black students, Black and brown. But if we're honest, mostly Black boys. So when we think about what our prison population looks like and who's mostly there, it is not, that Black people are inherently criminal, right? Because we know that some people have had those kinds of conversations as well, that sort of eugenic kind of conversation. It is that the country is deeply anti-Black. That's the issue. And so I can't thank you enough, Mark, for really partnering with families and communities from East Coast to West Coast, from the Deep South, and of course, the Midwest. I think maybe we were the only group from the Midwest. Did you interview anybody from Michigan or Chicago?
Yeah, no, we had Chicago also.
Chicago, yeah.
But Chicago's it's an important city, and it's an part also in the book. But I think as far as all of these other cities in the Midwest, Chicago's not the whole Midwest. So no, I appreciate that. I mean, the city I came from, Springfield, Massachusetts, is similar in some ways.
Exactly.
Small, medium size, used to be an industrial city.
Yep, just like
industrialization really undermined, working families and concentrations of poverty and disinvestment in communities, Black communities in particular. And then the schools being part of that whole, we're going to disinvest in communities. So our schools are now going to be about discipline and control, not about educating people to lift them up, more about disciplining, controlling, pushing down, pushing into criminal justice system. And, the whole, one thing that I do, this book is not mainly about how the school to prison pipeline operates. It's mainly about how people organize to change it. So, but there is a chapter about how it operates. And one of the things that I try to lift up that I don't think is that much appreciated is how this is really an intergenerational system of criminal.
Yes.
It's like parents.
I was going to get to the historical context, but you got there on your own. Go ahead.
Well, there's one statistic that I think people just, aren't really aware of. That, a Black child this was a study, Black child that's born in 1990, but nothing's changed. So Black children born in 1990, by the age 14, fully a quarter of them have had a parent in prison.
Yeah.
A quarter. That's staggering.
Yeah.
In this country, that's staggering. Now, I guess, I know, Zakiya, you know this, but I think that a lot of people just don't.
Well, it's to my point. The country is deeply anti-Black.
What does that mean?
Right.
And, and just as a side point, and I don't think this is true, but there's a lot of teachers and say, well, Black parents don't care. How come they're not coming into school or whatever? And that's not true. They do care. But, a quarter of them are in prison. What about that?
What about that? Exactly. A quarter of them are in prison. The Black parents don't come. Well, you done locked them up and the mother's at work. You done locked up the fathers and the mother's at work. She can't come.
Right. Now, and then, of course, people do care and they have other ways of caring, but they're not welcome. When they're caring means we have a criticism of the school. Well, that's not welcome. That's not a good parent that we want to encourage, right? Because so we are, But I think that intergenerational transmission, and is really what this system is about. And just one more, I don't want to overwhelm people.
No, this is good.
But, if you're a Black boy and then a man, that does not have a high school degree. So you're pushed out through suspensions, expulsions. Finally, you're pushed out of school. You don't get your high school degree. Your chances of ending up in prison at some point in your life is 2/3. So 2/3 of all Black men without a high school degree will end up in prison at some point in their lives. I mean, that's
2/3.
1/3 are in prison at any one time.
Yeah. So it sounds like this country has a Black man problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really want the Black man gone. Just throw them away, leave them in prison.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how else you can read that.
Yeah. No.
Because I mean, there's a very specific targeting. And Mark, this really ties right in to how I even got into the work.
Right.
It's through my son, who was just 3 years old. Right. So the system literally starts in on little Black boy children. And as you know, one of your colleagues in higher education, Dr. William Gilliam, has done several research studies on preschool expulsion. And at the time this had happened to my son, he had just released the first one. And I talked to him on the phone for about 2 hours. Right. And, he and I, kind of started working together. He'd come to Ohio several times since then, and actually came to Dayton because Dayton rolled out something called Preschool Promise. And I pushed them. I said, we're not having Preschool Promise and not talking about the preschool to prison pipeline impacting Black boys in Dayton. We're not doing that. Right. And they relented, and they brought in Gloria Ladson Billings to talk about curriculum, to get them on board with anti-racist education. And they also brought in Dr. Gilliam. Okay. And as you know, he highlights how Black boys are overwhelmingly kicked out at 3, 4, and 5 years old. So it sounds to me that the plan is working, right? Literally start on them when they're babies still, and make sure that they never reach their full potential. Yeah. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's like reality.
That's reality out there. Yes. The system is set up. Some people say it's working the way it was set up to work. It's not failing. It's succeeding at the way it was set up to work. Which is, to reproduce the racial order in this society. Mm-hmm. And, I think that, Black boys by sheer number are, at the center of this assault. But, we also know that Black girls,
Black children, period. That's right.
Yeah, so I don't want to, we're not being exclusive here. Black girls and gender conforming students are also, in fact, Black girls are, compared to white girls, as we know, they're suspended 6 times.
It's 6 times.
It's even more. The disparity is even higher.
The disparity is great. Yeah.
Your numbers and this, of this epidemic is confronting the boys, but it's also important what's happening with girls or gender nonconforming students, Latinx students, Indigenous students are all being swept up into this system. As well. And so in the book, we try to, travel to different places, listen to different stories, talk about how an inclusive movement, does not have to set competition up between whether it's Black, whether it's
group, boys. Yeah, what is it called? The Oppression Olympics?
Black Olympics. That's not what, a successful movement is not an oppression Olympics. And people have to, listen to each other and take the time to address the specific, because the specifics are also somewhat different, right? Girls are targeted for some gender, girl specific. They're loud. Black girls are loud, or their hair, or they're talking back. Some are similar, but some are also different. There's sexual harassment by police, school resource officers. So there's lots of different issues that I think, this movement. So part of it is to try to weave together the stories that create a larger movement where lots of people can feel like they have a place, that they're listened to, that they're supported. And I think that's, what has been achieved, which is not easy, right? It's not easy to do. And there's limited resources. Let's be real, right? There's limited resources out there. There's limited time. So, competition can be encouraged sometimes by foundations or systems that were set up to keep people down, keep people fighting
Right.
each other rather
Right.
than working together.
Hmm.
So that I think that's a huge part of it.
That's
And
exactly right. For folks who are just joining us, welcome. Make sure you hit the like button, share this broadcast. We welcome any questions. Do you have any questions right now for our guests? We are interviewing Professor Mark Warren, PhD, Professor of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. And he is the author of a collection of essays, including one from yours truly, Willful Defiance. And we have posted the link in the chat, and you can hit that link to get 30% off. And we sure hope that folks take a look. You can also hit the link from the People's Think Tank, which I also serve on the steering committee for. There's lots of good work still happening to ensure equity in schools, and that we're plugging this school to prison pipeline in the United States. Mark, one more question for you. What do you, from your perspective, right, what do you want people to learn or to take away? What are the key takeaways you really want people to have when they purchase this book?
Right. That's a good question.
Yeah.
No, and I will say that we do. This book came out of a partnership. It was produced in a partnership that included folks like you, Zakiya, and many others from Dignity in Schools. I mean, you actually were part of a committee of people that were established to check me out as a white male scholar.
Oh, we had to check you out, Mark. Took us a whole year to check you out.
Yeah, you did, which is important. And we had some ways that we had to build our relationship and work out some things. But, I think that's important. It's important for people like myself to try to be open to that process, right? And to really form a partnership where people can be open and challenge me and find, so that the project is meant to support the movement, not just produce a book. And, I win an award and I have a career, whatever I have. As an academic, it's meant to support the movement. So if you do go to the website, you will find also resources. If you want to organize or advocate against the school to prison pipeline, we're trying to present resources, connections to organizations and groups, help you get involved, right? And so part of it is, okay, well, what's the takeaway? I think there's several takeaways from the book. I think for educators and education policy makers, I want them to come away with a deep appreciation for the importance of parents and students of color being part of an essential part of the effort to systemic change in our public education system. They're not uncaring people. They're not problems to be solved. They're not opponents that need to be pushed away. They are essential people to this effort. They have been essential. They were the first to name the school prison pipeline, the first to organize and actually change policies before any educators wanted to talk about it. And so educators and policymakers need to understand that, and they need to change their attitude and approach to reach out and partner with parents and young people who not partnered along the school's agenda, but to listen to what parents and young people are saying and to partner around an agenda that is centered in parents and young people's struggles for educational justice. So that's, I think, a huge takeaway and key theme of the book for anybody to appreciate. This is not a book about people who are victims. Yes, there are victims of the school pipeline, but the people are not only victims.
Right.
They are racial justice organizers. They band together with other people and support each other and in many cases organize for change. And that, I think, has to be recognized. So that's a huge takeaway. I think for people who are already in the movement, I would like them to get the takeaway that we need to find ways to build national movements that support local organizing, the importance of local. You can't just be organizing in your local area anymore. Your opponents are too big. They're too powerful. So here are some lessons about how to organize locally that are in the book. but also about how to connect up to people across localities, but to do that in a way that keeps the movement accountable to people in community, not to professional advocates in Washington. So that's another takeaway. And then I think the third, and even though it's not the main focus of the book, I think for a lot of people, let me say whiter, more affluent Americans who have no idea what is really happening in schools in low-income Black and brown communities in this country. They don't send their kids there. It's not covered in the media, as we just talked about.
Right.
They have no idea. And I think that the book is also meant to give people a sense of the depth, the extent and depth of abuse and criminalization that's happening of children and their parents and their families. And it's a call to action to support that movement in whatever way they can. And I think I try to talk about my own journey, some of my experiences doing this research, trying to be a little bit open about even the trauma, frankly, Zakiya, that I experienced just going out into communities and listening to story after story of people being abused and brutalized. And again, right, I have privileges. I get to go back to my academic place, to my home in Boston. But if you are a caring person, this affects you.
That's right.
And, and if it's affecting me this way, God knows how it's impacting people who are directly being impacted, who don't have the choice of going off somewhere. But I think telling that stories and having people follow me a little bit in this journey, I think may be a way for, more whiter, more affluent folks to really listen and hear some of these stories in the way that I heard them. And I think, and hopefully respond in positive and supportive ways.
Well, we certainly encourage everyone with this book. We do have one question from the audience for you, Mark. It's from my colleague, Maureen Kelleher. She wants to know, how are efforts to end the school-to-prison pipeline faring in recent years? Illinois has passed a low-limit suspension. The pandemic has made it hard to evaluate results.
Yeah.
What do you think? So,
great question. I think recent years, meaning since the start of the pandemic, it has been very challenging. I'll say that in the big picture of the last 15 years that the book covers, that the movement has really made incredible gains and has changed policy away from zero tolerance discipline policies in districts and states across the country. Over half the states in the United States now have changed their school discipline policies. Most districts have away from zero tolerance, and we have seen suspensions and expulsion rates fall in places particularly in places where there have been strong organizing efforts. So I talk a lot about Los Angeles. There were dramatic changes through over almost 20 years now of persistent organizing. They were able to get suspensions for willful defiance ended entirely in Los Angeles schools, and for I think it's K through 8 now statewide. So days lost to suspensions in Los Angeles there were 75,000 days lost in 2008. 10 years later, there were 5,600. So from 75,000 to 5,600. Illinois, I do have the statistics for Illinois in here, or Chicago. I'd have to look them up. I don't want to be misquoted, but the suspension rates were falling, partly in response to, I think you're referring to SB 100, Senate Bill 100 that passed in 2015. Right. And actually, I tell the story of that organizing campaign led by the Voice Coalition, the student coalition in Chicago, to get that law passed with other partners like COFI, Community Organizing for Family Issues, and others.
That's right.
Suspension rates have fallen there too. Now, having said that, first of all, racial disparities have not fallen.
Right. They've actually increased the racial disparities. So they just stopped at suspending white kids altogether, and everybody else.
Yeah. But still, the numbers of Black students in those places have fallen substantially.
Sure.
Right? It's just that the comparison of Black to white hasn't shifted. So if you're suspending students, you're still suspending the Black students, and this is the heart of the anti-Black racism. But so and then the next issue would also be, policing by some measures, arrests of students had gone up during the same period. And so now I think the new wave, I think efforts continue to reduce what's called exclusionary discipline, suspensions and expulsions. But, the new wave of the movement, if you're asking how the movement is faring, where there's a lot of energy and organizing now, is to remove police from schools. And that is what I would call the new frontier of the movement. Not that it's entirely new. People don't always appreciate that this has been going on for over 10 years. The Black Organizing Project in Oakland declared its mission to remove all police from schools 10 years ago. And of course, they were told, you're crazy. That will never happen, right? 10 years later, they have disbanded the Oakland School Police Department.
Yes.
So, so there's the success of that, but that's the beginnings. I mean, for the most part, police are deeply entrenched, and not just police, policing practices are deeply entrenched. So even if you remove the police, well, are you calling the police back in, even if they're not stationed there? Or how exactly, has there really been a change in the climate and culture of schooling, the relationships between teachers and students and their families? Is this a safe and supportive and empowering, culturally relevant school and its curriculum? And that, I think, this is what we're really, the big picture is that ending the school to prison pipeline has to be the wedge to the transformation of our schools away from schools of discipline and control and alien institutions that are not teaching young people culturally relevant curriculum or in culturally relevant ways. So those are some thoughts. I think we're in a turbulent period. I think it's, there also, the forces have now organized against some of the gains that have been won, as Zakiya and we were just discussing earlier. It's always a fight like that. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. also said, the arc of history bends towards justice. It bends slowly, but it goes in way. There are setbacks, right? There are setbacks also along the way, and it is a little unclear to me how much the arc of history really has. I mean, certainly there are major changes. We don't want to minimize them. Slavery was abolished. Legal Jim Crow segregation was abolished. These are major, huge wins. But the rise of the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander calls it, the mass criminalization and incarceration of young people, of Black and brown people, which starts in school. And that's the point, that mass incarceration starts in school.
That's right.
And that is just still probably not really appreciated. The first contact that a lot of young people have with the police is in school, for willfully disruptive or something of that nature, right? And then the police are called, and they end up in the court system or the juvenile justice system for minor infractions, if any infraction at all, frankly. So
yeah.
So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, we appreciate you, Mark. Thanks so much for this second book, highlighting and chronicling the very important work to end the school to prison pipeline here in the United States. Willful Defiance. The link is in the chat, y'all. Make sure you go and get it. You get 30% off. We're coming up on the holidays. It's a good stocking stuffer to your favorite organizers and activists in the country. And you don't just have to be an education activist to get this book. If you have folks in your family or close friends who are activists, whether the issue, is education or not, or healthcare, there's some things to learn. There's some key lessons from the organizers in this book that you can learn. So I really want to encourage people to support this work. This is a way to make sure that the grassroots organizers and activists across this country are recognized for their work, because a lot of the folks you're going to read about are Black folks, many of them Black women from the Mississippi Delta to Dayton, Ohio. Thank you, Mark. We appreciate you. This has been a good broadcast. You have any final thoughts you want to share with folks?
Well, just want to say, thank you, Zakiya, for inviting me here to share this work. I'd just like to say that, this is it's a positive book. It's a hopeful book. It's not namby-pamby or pie-eyed at all. There's a lot of deep stuff in here that I've learned from people, but it's also hopeful in that we, people, not that just that we can change the system. People have changed the system, and they're working towards a vision for education as liberation. And I feel honored that I was welcomed into this movement to play my role in a way to contribute to it. So, yes, I would like you to buy the book and read the book. But more importantly, I would like you to, organize or support the movement and the organizations that's happening to make change wherever you are and wherever community or larger metropolitan area that you find yourself.
All right. Thank you. See you guys next week. Same place, same time. This is Building Power. I'm your host, Zakiya Sankara-Jabbar. Next Wednesday, I am interviewing Christopher Scott, who is a director at the Open Society Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And we'll be talking about the Counselors Not Cops federal bill to get the police out of schools. Y'all don't want to miss it. Join us next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.